All right. So last week was week 3. This is week 4. Last week we talked about Lady Jane Grey, who was the teenage Protestant martyr. From there, Bloody Mary took over. She reigned for about 5 years. She returned England to Catholicism. Then her half-sister, when she died, her half-sister Elizabeth took over and would reign almost the remainder of the 16th century. She was Protestant, and she returned England to Protestant practices that her half-brother Edward had really started. From there, the Church of England, known as the Anglican Church, emerged. Eventually, other Protestant denominations would separate from the Church of England, and Baptists were one of those denominations, were one of those groups. Charles Spurgeon, I'm assuming most of you have heard of him. I don't know if you know much about him, but he was a Victorian-era Baptist preacher, and he was one of the most popular, if not the most popular preachers of all time. He was known as the Prince of Preachers, and today we're going to learn about his wife, Susie. Have you guys heard of this book before? It just came out in 2018. It's a little gem. I love it. Susie was born Susannah Thompson on January 5th, 1832 in London into a Christian family, and she was an only child. Queen Victoria became queen 5 years later when Susie was 5 and would reign until 1901, 2 years before Susie's death. So almost her entire life was spent in the Victorian era. And she was just surrounded by Victorian culture her whole life. So if you know much about Victorian culture, that's when she lived. Her family was upper middle class, and she was educated in literature, art, language, music. From a teenager on, she traveled often to Paris to receive education there and to learn the French language. And she often spent time with a family in Paris of a French Reformed pastor. He invited people to live with his family. His wife had died, to just help young girls learn the French language and, I guess, French culture and see things. So she took advantage of that. I don't know if she stayed there every time, but so she was like a woman of upper middle class young woman of culture. Despite her upbringing, though, so she had been around, she was born into a Christian family and spent a lot of time with another Christian family in Paris. And despite all that, she still just had a cultural Christianity. It was really just a way of life, which was kind of common in the Victorian era. She didn't, until she was almost 21, she never claimed to have true faith. She dates a date in right before she turned 21 is when she was actually converted. So at that time, that was a Sunday evening in late 1852. So she states, although she was converted at that time, over the next year or so, she still had doubts about her faith and what she would call like backsliding. So around the time of her conversion, Susie's parents moved into Susie's mom's sister's house. So it was Susie's Aunt Mary. This gets a little confusing. Susie's Aunt Mary had a daughter named Susannah. So when I say Susie, I'm talking about Susie Spurgeon. Susannah was Susie's cousin. Anyway, Susannah married a man named William Olney and had been married to him for a few years. And Susie was close to Susannah and her husband and his family, the Olneys. The Olneys went to a church called New Park Street Chapel in London. This church didn't have a pastor anymore. It was kind of in decline. During this same time that Susie was living with them and with Susannah's mom, but also really hanging out with the Olneys, she became close to them. Charles Spurgeon was becoming a popular preacher in rural England. He was 19 at the time. So a London visitor went to a place where he was preaching in Cambridge around the same time and heard him preach and said, this guy needs to come to New Park Street Chapel and they need to hear him preach. So they invited him to New Park Street Chapel because they were in decline to preach in late 1853. So this was about a year after Susie's conversion. He came on Sunday morning, and apparently the seats weren't all filled. There were lots of empty spaces, and he was not used to that because he was used to. I mean, by the time he was 19, even in rural England, he had full houses. So for his Sunday night sermon that night, they tried to find everybody. The men that had invited him said, we need this guy. Like, he preaches the gospel, and he's a little unconventional. He's kind of country and a little disheveled, and he doesn't look like a city boy, but he really preached the gospel, and they thought he would do well at New Park Street Chapel. So they went around inviting everybody to come, and they basically pled with Susie to come and hear this guy speak. And so since she was so close to the Olneys, and they were prominent members of this church, she went to basically appease them. But she had heard, that she had heard about his sermon. Yes, he preached the gospel and he did it well, but she was more concerned that his appearance didn't meet the standards that she thought a preacher should meet. And she wrote somewhere that the countrified preacher, and she just thought he was disheveled and whatever, and was not impressed. So she went and she listened to him, but she was so distracted by his appearance that she couldn't really appreciate what he was preaching. And she even looks back at that time and says, calls it the first time she ever heard her dear husband preach, and she says, I was not at all fascinated by the young orator's eloquence. And later in life, she said she regretted these thoughts and said she was not spiritually minded enough to understand his earnest presentation of the gospel and his powerful pleading with sinners. Thankfully, though, many godly-minded people in the church saw past that, and they, before his trial period was even over, they asked him to become their permanent pastor, which he accepted in April of 1854. So by April of 1854, Susie had confided in her cousin's husband her doubts about her faith and the fact that she was backsliding and the fact that it was bothering her. And so he probably told Charles Spurgeon, because he had been guest preaching and was becoming the permanent pastor there, because Charles Spurgeon gifted Susie, he didn't know her very well, with the illustrated copy of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And he wrote inside of it, what did he say? Miss Thompson, with desires for her progress in the blessed pilgrimage, from C.H. Spurgeon, April 20th, 1854. This book seemed to have a great impact on Susie, and she was also impressed, she writes, with his desire to help her struggling soul. And she eventually, at some point over the next couple months, even confides in Charles and says, and she writes about this encounter, by degrees, though with much trembling, I told him of my state before God, and he gently led me by his preaching and by his conversations through the power of the Holy Spirit to the cross of Christ for the peace and pardon my weary soul was longing for. So he was instrumental in bringing her doubts, to light, and then helping her get rid of those. By June of 1854, their friendship had grown, because occasionally, she saw him at church, and occasionally he would come to the Olney's house while she would come to the Olney's house too. And in June of 1854, a place called the Crystal Palace was reopening, and there was going to be a big public event, and there was a big procession, parades. It was a huge ordeal. Someone called it something similar to like a World's Fair, or a World Fair. So they were sitting there, Charles and the Olneys, I think, and some other people from New Park Street Chapel were sitting there waiting for the procession to begin. And he had a book, and he opens it up, and he was like, Susie, will you read these words right here? And it was titled like On Marriage or something like that. And this makes me laugh. Because I just imagine, what would you guys do if this happened to you? And she reads it, and it says, towards the end of the section, it said, if thou art to have a wife of thy youth, she is now living on the earth. Therefore think of her, and pray for her will, yea, though thou hast not seen her. And after she read it, he leaned over and whispered, do you pray for him who is to be your husband? And she said, before this, she claimed she had no clue that he had any feelings for her whatsoever. And she said she just looked down and her face flushed. She's like, my heart started beating. She was like, I didn't know what to do. And then she said, but then the procession began. And she said the glittery lights of that procession didn't compare to the emotions exploding inside of her. It's cute, because I didn't realize that Charles Spurgeon could be like this, and it was funny to me. But they snuck off and away from the group so that they could walk around the gardens. And they talked, and she still, like, later in her life, remembers that sweet day in June, at the Crystal Palace. Yeah. She records, during that walk on that memorable day in June, I believe God himself united us to each other forever. From that time, our friendship grew apace and quickly ripened into the deepest love. So Charles proposed 2 months later. In August of 1854, they would marry in January of 1856. But so they had about a little over a year being engaged. He actually didn't tell her that he loved her or anything like that until the day he proposed. They were in her grandfather's gardens, but she said it wasn't the prettiest place, because they weren't like the best gardens. It was kind of a little dreary, but she loved it because then from then on, every time she went to her grandfather's gardens, it reminded her of that day. Apparently, he professed his love for her that day. In December of that year, she applied for membership in New Park Street Chapel. The next month, she gave her verbal testimony out loud to the church of her verbal testimony of her faith in Christ. She was baptized by Charles on February 1st of 1855. They still weren't married yet. During their engagement, they would usually meet about once a week at the Crystal Palace to walk and talk. So on Thursday nights, they would have service on Thursday nights, and she loved this tradition. He would walk down and after preaching, and he would lean over to her at the end of the aisle and whisper, 3 p.m., 3 p.m. And that meant that they were to meet at Crystal Palace, which was outside of London, at 3 p.m. the next day. That was their little code. So he would take a train to London. She would actually walk from her house, which was 7 miles. So she was a pretty active young lady. She would walk 7 miles there and back, and then walk around with him on those days that they met. I think it's important because later in life she becomes an invalid, and it's just the contrast of that to how active she had been in her earlier years. They had a fun and playful romance. Even during their engagement, he started using her help in his work. He actually gave her a list of some writings of a Puritan writer. At one point, his name was Thomas Brooks, I think. Anyway, and he asked her to write down, to read through it and note any of the poem or any of the passages that meant something to her. So she went through and notated everything, and he ended up using those in a book that he called Smooth Stones by Ancient Brooks or something like that. I don't remember the exact name. Her name is not on the book anywhere, and she didn't receive any credit, but she didn't really want any credit, she says. She just wanted to help, and it was just sweet that even from their engagement, he was already using her like in his professional life, and just they were beginning to be a team. This is an interesting story. During their for some people, this could probably have ended their engagement, but not them. During their engagement, there's a book, and it's online. I'm going to read her words because she says it better than me. During their engagement, she said, "This is the story. He was to preach at the large hall of the Horns in Kennington, which was not very far from where we then resided," meaning her parents. "He asked me to accompany him and dined with us. We went together happily enough in a cab, and I well remember trying to keep close by his side as we mingled with the mass of people thronging up the staircase. But by the time we had reached the landing, he had forgotten my existence. The burden of the message he had to proclaim to that crowd of immortal souls was upon him, and he turned into the small side door where the officials were awaiting him, without for a moment realizing that I was left to struggle as best I could with the rough and eager throng around me. At first, I was utterly bewildered, and then, I am sorry to have to confess, I was angry. I at once returned home and told my grief to my gentle mother, who tried to soothe my ruffled spirit and bring me to a better frame of mind. She wisely reasoned that," and just think about this mom, because I think about not every mom would say this. "She wisely reasoned that my chosen husband was no ordinary man, and that his whole life was absolutely dedicated to God and his service, and that I must never hinder him by trying to put myself first in his heart. Presently, after much good and loving counsel, my heart grew soft, and I saw I had been very foolish and willful. And then a cab drew up at the door, and dear Mr. Spurgeon came running into the house in great excitement, calling, 'Where's Susie? I've been searching for her everywhere and cannot find her. Has she come back by herself?' My dear mother went to him, took him aside, and told him all the truth. I think when he realized the state of things, she had to soothe him also, for he was so innocent at heart of having offended me in any way that he must have felt I had done him an injustice in thus doubting him. At last, mother came down to fetch me to him, and I went downstairs. Quietly, he let me tell him how indignant I had felt, and then he repeated mother's little lesson, assuring me of his deep affection for me, but pointing out that before all things he was God's servant, and I must be prepared to yield my claims to his. I never forget the teaching of that day. I learned my hard lesson by heart, for I do not recollect ever again seeking to assert my right to his time and attention when any service for God demanded them. It was ever the settled purpose of my married life that I should never hinder him in his work for the Lord, never try to keep him from fulfilling his engagements, and never plead my own ill health as a reason why he should remain at home with me. I thank God now that he enabled me to carry out this determination and rejoice that I have no cause to reproach myself with being a drag on the swift wheels of his consecrated life. And I do not take any credit to myself for this. It was the Lord's will concerning me, and he saw to it that I received the necessary training whereby, in after years, I could cheerfully surrender his servant to the incessant demands of his ministry. Anyway, it could sound like that Charles completely disregarded her too, but he didn't. He was a very busy man, but he was very sweet and loving, and he took care of her, and he always made sure that she was taken care of at home. So if you read the book, there are lots of examples of just how sweet he was to her and how much he made sure that she was taken care of. So let's see. Finally, they married on January 8th, 1856. And by September of that year, September 20th, they had twin boys. So she's pretty much pregnant their entire time they were married. At first. Only a month after the twin boys were born, Charles O. would experience a catastrophe that would devastate him and stick with him the rest of his life. He had become so popular in London that New Park Street Chapel couldn't hold everybody that wanted to hear him. And they had even expanded to hold 2,000 people, and that still wasn't enough. So they bought a plot of land, and they were going to build what's now known as the Metropolitan Tabernacle. And during that time, the church rented out a big music hall to hold services in that place. He, on the first service, Susie had to stay home because she had twin boys just a month prior. He was walking. He even said that as he was getting close, he noticed how many people were there and how it was even a little difficult for him to get inside. By the time he started preaching, that they said there were 10,000 people in the music hall and another 12,000 outside surrounding it. I know Daniel pointed out that he was like, you realize this is like preaching to Rupp Arena. And I was like, whew, that's a lot. So there were some troublemakers when he started preaching that yelled out, fire! The ceilings are falling, the galleries are falling, get out. And it just caused like a mass hysteria. Like people were running around trying to get out, and 7 people were trampled to death. One of those was a almost full-term pregnant lady who also lost her baby. And 28 people were seriously injured and had to be hospitalized. It greatly affected Charles. Susie, she writes about just how much this affected him, and she was instrumental in soothing him and consoling him and helping him get back to even be able to preach again. I think he took a month off. Some people thought he should take more off. But yeah, he had already suffered with some depression. This worsened that, and some people say today that his symptoms after that were very similar to PTSD. She said one time they were hiking somewhere, and the little goat or whatever that they had kind of lost his footing and kind of slipped down the mountain a little bit. And it was a little startling, but he had to just get off, and his heart was beating, and he was like, it like greatly affected him. And Susie thinks that it brought back the trauma of just all the trampling of that day, being inside that building, and how, newspapers write about how terror-stricken everybody was. But anyway, she said that was, she called that, something about the black shadow that God saw that he should put on their young, happy lives. But she was very graceful in the things that happened to her. and just said, if that's God's will, then we'll get through it. So that was almost a year into their marriage. They travel a lot, and he also began to travel a lot, and he would leave her often. She tried not to make him feel badly about it, but one time she did cry, and as he was leaving, let him see it, and he gently reminded her. He said that her willingness to let him go was her offering to God. So for the sake of time, I'm going to quickly go over kind of the next few years of her life. Basically, she was, like I said, a vibrant, active person. They traveled a lot around Europe. They traveled to big cities, Paris, Venice. They hiked the Alps. She even went with him to Geneva when he preached in Calvin's pulpit. So they enjoyed almost 10 years of just traveling and being active together. But then she was also very active in their church. They started a pastor's college, and they began an orphanage together. But about 12 years into their marriage, she fell ill and pretty much immediately was an invalid. She was in intense pain all the time. At that point, even church records show she stopped coming to church. But they point out, like, that did not mean that her service to Christ ceased. Actually, this is when one of her biggest ministries started. She also, during that time, I'll tell you about that ministry in a minute, but during that time, she would continue to help Charles on Saturday nights. Their tradition was that as he was preparing for his sermon the next day, she would sit in his library with him and help read commentaries to him about whatever he was going to preach the next day. And she said that was like very instructional and fruitful for her, because then she was still able to learn from him, even though she couldn't go to church the next day. She said, I would listen to the dear voice of my beloved as he explained what I cannot understand, or unfolds meanings which I should fail to see. They're just sweet. But yeah, he also liked her in there with him. One thing I put this in here because I wanted to make sure to say, when their son Thomas, he was the younger twin, when he was older, Charles wrote to him and said, at this point, their mom was an invalid and at home a lot. He said, when you see a lady of your own age who is at all like what your mother was, be sure to pop the question at once. I didn't know they used that terminology back then. If you get her and she lives to be what your mother is, you will lament her weakness and yet reckon her to be better than the strongest of women. So that just still shows you just how much Charles loved her, even though how sick she was. Beginning in 1872, Charles's health also began to decline so much. He suffered a lot as well, that his doctor recommended. Now think about this: that he spend every winter in Menton, France. Is basically kind of by the beach in warmer weather. Susie wasn't able to go. She couldn't even make the trip. It was a few days, and it was, it wasn't like just hopping on a plane like today. It was a hard trip. So she could never make the trip. So every winter from 1872 until he died, he spent winter months in France away from her. But he wrote her every single day. Yeah, and that was by a doctor's recommendation. That was a place that a lot of people went to heal, because the winter months in London were so harsh, and because of the Industrial Revolution, London had a lot of industry, and it was really smoky and smoggy and just gross. And so a lot of people thought that was really bad for health. So Susie would stay in London during those winter months, and Charles did make sure she had help. They had household workers, and one of those was Elizabeth Thorne, who became one of her closest friends. So that started in 1872. In 1874, when her twin boys were 18, they were baptized at the Metropolitan Tabernacle. Next, in the summer of 1875, this is when Susie starts what she calls her life work. She was sitting, and she read over Charles's most recent book, and it was called Lectures to My Students. And when she was done with it, she said out loud, "Oh, I wish that every pastor in England could have a copy of this," because she thought he just could express the gospel so well. She was really proud of him. But she wanted it because for the sake of the other pastors, not for Charles's fame. And he looked at her and said, "Will you make it happen?" And she said, "What will you pay?" And she never had thought about that. She said she kind of went to her room and thought, "Man, I have the desire to do it, but I never thought, do I have the ability to carry it out, or am I willing to assist and carry it out, or do it myself? So she found a little stash of money that she had, and it was enough to purchase 100 books. So she started and funded the beginning of what would be called Mrs. Spurgeon's Book Fund. And it can sound kind of silly, but it went on for 28 years, and it was pretty tremendous. Over 28 years, she would distribute over 200 or almost 200,000 books. I think how many? It was hundreds of thousands of sermons, his written sermons that they would have printed and worldwide. But she had very strict requirements to be able to receive money or books from the book fund. You had to be poor, and by poor you had to make at today's money $17,000 or less per year, and as a pastor, you also had to be an evangelical pastor, and you had to be the actual leader of your church, and have a church under your charge. So she was very meticulous with her record keeping. She would keep an account of every pound and shilling that came in, every book that came in, every book that went out, who it went to, what date. People would start to donate to her. I mean, she started it, but people would give her money to continue this fund. A pastor would apply. When they applied, if they were accepted, she would gather together a little package with 7 or 8 books, some printed sermons, and somebody at least at the beginning had donated a large amount of stationery. So she would give some stationery for the pastor also. And the poorest ones would also get a copy of this magazine that Charles helped write or edit. And she would send a handwritten letter to each pastor that she sent it to. And she was a very good writer. I mean, you think she was educated and spent time in Paris, and so she could write very well. She eventually, this is kind of an aside, I think she published maybe 5 books in her life, but she didn't consider herself a writer. If I published 5 books in my life, I would probably consider myself a writer. But I think Charles published about 150. So that's probably, it was like, oh, I'm just my little 5 books over here. I'm not a writer. So anyway, she felt really strongly that some of these pastors literally had no books. And she said she would sit there and just think about these pastors who were, spending their lives trying to preach the gospel to their congregations, and would just sit there and, with no help on how to prepare a sermon. She would help. She said, I remember sitting there every Saturday night with Charles and reading commentaries. And he benefited from other books. He had 12,000 books in his library. 12,000 books. They're now most of them are now in Missouri. Daniel just found that out last night and spent the next hour looking up where his books were and wants to make a trip there now. I bet a lot of your husbands like Charles Spurgeon. So anyway, she would also receive, some people would send her books to include in her book fund. She would read them. If they were too superficial or they had faulty theology, she just threw them out. And they had to be good books. And this was not just for them to have a free book. It was for them to have a free book that would help them proclaim the gospel well. So anyway, this was no small endeavor. She was in intense pain. Some days she would say she couldn't even lift her hand because she was in so much pain. There's a record of, in February of 1883, it was a 28-day month, she received 657 letters. Can you imagine writing back to 657 people in 1 month? To me, if I had to write 2 letters in a month, that would stress me out. Because that's just a large, and not only that, having to read them, see if they meet all the criteria, package up everything. Because she would choose what that she thought would fit them well, and which sermons would go, and then send them out, and write everybody who didn't get accepted. Have to write them back. She would write them a nice little letter too, and explain why they didn't. And this was all as an invalid, in pain. She, yeah. So I just think that was pretty amazing. And in addition to the book fund, she started the Pastor's Aid Fund to help poor pastors. One pastor wrote to her and said, my wife and daughters have only one dress for Sunday school and the weekday, and we all only have one pair of boots, and they're in bad shape. And she was a the big advocate for pastors, and she would get really upset and frustrated with churches that didn't take care of their pastors, and thought if those churches can't, other churches around them should come in and help them too. She's like, there's no reason why a pastor and his family should only have one pair of clothes and boots that don't work. I mean, they're falling apart. That was something that was greatly on her heart. She also started a book ministry for a pastor's conference for students. When they would come to this annual conference, she would give them free books. Let's see. Most of the books she donated were Charles's, but there were other books too. So she didn't only give away Charles Spurgeon's books, but he did write about 150. So she had a lot to choose from him. Let's see. She even received requests from the clergymen from the Church of England, and she would sometimes send them some of his printed sermons, and they would use abbreviated forms of his sermons in Church of England pulpits. And she said that just made her so happy that like his evangelical Baptist sermons were being preached in Church of England pulpits sometimes. Anyway, I said before, she continued this book fund for 28 years until she died in 1903. Someone else took it up and even continued it a little bit longer than that after she died. This is where it says she distributed almost 200,000 books to over 25,000 pastors, as well as hundreds of thousands of his written sermons throughout the world. He was an amazing preacher, but Susie's lifelong work with the book fund ensured that his name and works would be distributed widely throughout England and even around the world. It talks about her legacy here. It says, her legacy isn't just the book fund as much as it is what she did to help Charles be who he could be. And the fact that we know so much about him today and have his written sermons and they were so widely distributed was because of her book fund. And just like what she did, like her life's work really was to help Charles, but not because to make him famous as much as because she thought he preached the gospel so well. That was her number one. That was her number one goal. By the late 1880s, Charles's health was in great decline. He continued to spend his winter months in Menton, France, even though Susie couldn't be with him. In 1887, another one of the most distressing events of Charles's career began. It was known as the downgrade controversy, and it was kind of a theological controversy with other pastors. He ended up that year having to resign from the Baptist Union, which was apparently a really big deal. And she writes about how much he suffered over this. It was a huge deal. Imagine if you were ostracized by all of your friends and in the group of people of faith that you are in. It was a huge deal to him. And not just that he thought they were downgrading the Bible. This was kind of when Darwin's Origin of Species came out and people were questioning things, and he thought he was still holding on to the supremacy of the Bible, and I guess some people, that's why it's called the downgrade controversy, where he thought we're downgrading it. Anyway, many of his friends and colleagues deserted him, but Susie continued to support him throughout all of that. So that was in 1887 when it started. In the fall of 1991, so in October, as he was beginning to prepare to go to Menton for the winter, miraculously and providentially probably, Susie's health became improved to the point where she was actually able to make the trip with him. So this is in 1891. He began going in 1872. She had never been to Menton. So she had heard about everything that he did there, but she had never gone with him. So she actually made the trip with him. I think it took 3 days to get there through all the different forms of transportation. They arrived in Menton at the end of October. She just talks about how delighted he was to have her there, and just like he was just like a little kid taking her around, and he called her wifey. Oh, dear wifey, and oh, my dear one, look at this. And there's one place he went, oh, dear wifey, isn't this just seeing this just worth making the trip in and of itself? And he was just so excited. And she calls, that month or those 3 months of the wintertime that they spent there, 3 months of perfect earthly happiness or something like that. Yeah, that's what she called it. In January of 1892, so at the start of the new year, they celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary and Susie's 60th birthday. He also held 2 small services in his room, in their hotel room, where they were staying on January 10th and Sunday, January 17th, with a group of their friends. his health began to decline, and on Wednesday, January 20th, he went to bed, and he would never get up. He never was able to get back out of bed. He remained there until the evening of January 31st when he died. And Susie, by God's providence, was able to be by his side by the grace of God. After he died, while still in his room, Susie prayed and thanked the Lord, this is in quotes, thanked the Lord for the precious treasure so long linked to her, and sought at the throne of grace strength and guidance for the future. She continued, "Oh, my husband, every moment of my now desolate life, I wonder how I can live without thee. The heart that for so many years has been filled and satisfied with thy love must needs be very empty and stricken now that thou art gone." But knowing that he was, what she said, it was far better for him to be with Christ, helped Susie heal. Susie also rejoiced that God allowed them to have that 3 months of perfect earthly happiness just before he passed away. She remained in Mentone for about another month before returning to London. He had also, this was interesting, I couldn't find it in here, but he had written to somebody back home and said, talking about his time there, and said, I should be back, I'll be back home in February, blah, 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 something like that. And his scholar or biographer wrote about that, saying how true, just the prophetic words of that. He was back home because he died late in the evening on January 31st, and he was back home by February. By March, she started her book fund work again. 3 years later, in 1895, she began to plant a church in a town with no Baptist church. She was able to visit this place called, I think it was Bexel-on-the-Sea, and while she was there, she asked somebody where the Baptist meeting place was, and they said, there is no Baptist meeting place. She said, well, I know there are Baptists who live here. There are no Baptist meeting place. Well, she proceeded to plant a church, and she didn't feel like you should go into debt to plant or build a church. So, I mean, this was no small undertaking. So she helped, and she had strict kind of rules about how you would fundraise for a church. So she helped see it through the building of the church, and even helped find them a pastor. So she and I think they said that it's still there today, the church that she helped plant, and they're still meeting. She also wrote a couple more books, and co-edited as well as contributed to the 4-volume edition of C.H. Spurgeon's autobiography. Also the Metropolitan Tabernacle, the one that they had built, it was destroyed by fire in April of 1898, and she was instrumental in helping to raise funds to help rebuild it. She even held a fundraiser against her doctor's orders. Some people asked her to come, and she sat in some church and would let people come visit her. Apparently she was in really bad health by this time, but she mustered up enough strength, and they came to visit her. I think thousands of people came, and she raised $30,000 to help, just in a couple hours, to help rebuild $30,000 probably today, to help start rebuilding the tabernacle. Let's see. Susie died on October 22nd, 1903 in her home, 11 years after Charles died. In the days before her death, her friend Elizabeth Thorne nursed her and remained by her side. Her son, about 5 days before her death, she called her son Thomas to come see her, and she wanted to give him a blessing. And he said that after he blessed her, he said, what she said will echo in my grateful heart till I also hear the master's call. He loved her. Thomas was a mama's boy. He loved his mom. The older boy was called Charles. And then also the day before Thomas visited, Susie was in a little bit better spirits and was able to talk a little bit more. Apparently she was talking to Elizabeth, her friend, who had been there this whole time and was nursing her. And at one point Susie asked her, "Whom shall I see next?" And Elizabeth said, I don't know, darling. Who do you want to see next?" And she said, Susie just sat there and all of a sudden just beamed and smiled and said, "My husband." She was ready to go home. And then at the very end of her life, she said, blessed Jesus, I can see the King in his glory." And that was Susie. And that's only just a small tidbit. She wrote so much, and Charles wrote so much, that we have so many of just all the little things that they said to each other. Oh, I wanted to read one thing to you. One time they were moving a house, and she was sick and an invalid, and Charles, as busy as he was, he wrote her, this is what he was doing. "I've been quite a long round today, if a round can be long. First to Finsbury to buy the wardrobe, a beauty. I hope you will live long enough to hang your garments in it, every thread of them precious to me for your dear sake. Next to Hewlett's for a chandelier for the dining room, found one quite to my taste and yours. Then to Negretti and Zombra's to buy a barometer for my very own fancy, for I have promised to treat myself to one. On the road, I obtained the Pressburg biscuits, and within their box I send this note, hoping it may reach you the more quickly. They are sweetened with my love and prayers. The bedroom will look well with the wardrobe in it, at least so I hope. It is well made, and I believe, as nearly as I could tell, precisely all you wished for. I bought also a table for you in case you should have to keep your bed. It rises and falls by a screw and also winds sideways so as to go over the bed. And then it has a flap for a book or paper so that my dear one may read or write in comfort while lying down. I could not resist the pleasure of making this little gift to my poor suffering wifey, only hoping it might not often be in requisition, but might be a help when there was needs be for it. Remember, all I buy I pay for. I have paid for everything as yet with the earnings of my pen, graciously sent me in time of need. It is my ambition to leave nothing for you to be anxious about. I shall find the money for the curtains, and you will amuse yourself by giving orders for them after your own delightful taste. I don't know. It was just, they had such a sweet little romance. I think there's another book coming out. I don't know if that he said is a follow-up called Spurgeon in Love. So I told him, I'm going to be the first one to buy that. But this is really sweet. It has some pictures of some of the places that he talks about. But this is written by Ray Rhodes Jr. He lives in Georgia, but is somehow a professor at Southern or some. I'm not sure how that works. But anyways. I could be getting the particulars wrong, but he did a really good job. This started from, I guess, his thesis or something when he was getting his doctorate. And so not a whole lot wasn't known about her. She had a biography written about her in the early 1900s, and then really nobody else has really picked up and tried to find anything new. And so he went to Europe and he found a lot about her and a lot of her writings and stuff. So anyway, if you get a chance to read this book, it's really sweet. It's really sweet. But anyway, that's it. And I think it's 10:12. We'll go ahead and end. Yeah.
Does it ever say what was her health issue?
Well, okay. Right. They're not sure. They think it was, they called it a woman problem because first she was never able to have more children. She only had those two. There was a book, they found a book that was out of place in Charles Spurgeon's library called something about uterine diseases and how they affect. I mean, it was, kind of an odd book to have. And she was also noted to have surgery by a well-known, gynecological surgeon of the time. So although it never really says what she has, some people say she probably either had a tumor or endometriosis. But some of her other symptoms may have been another disease as well, but she probably had some sort of gynecological, but they don't really know. So yeah, there's a lot of speculation, but because of those two things, they think that's what that was. So, and Charles had gout and kidney problems, and his health was not very well either. Susie actually thinks that the downgrade controversy was what led to his early death. She thinks that he was really torn up about that, and just his health kind of plummeted. And he died when he was in his 50s. So, anyway, yeah.
Is he buried in France then at that point?
No, they shipped him back to. Yeah, they shipped him back to London, and they were they're buried in. You can see it says where they're buried. She actually stayed back in. She sent his body on ahead before she came, and I think she's buried right next to him now too in England. But. Any other questions? This was really fun. I listened to the audiobook first, but it was twice. It was a little confusing because I couldn't tell where the quotations started, So I if you want to, you can listen to it, but I recommend actually buying the book because then you get to see what was a quotation and what were the author's words, because there's a lot of, because she wrote so much that a lot of this was basically her own words. But anyway, I hope that was encouraging, and I'll end this with prayer, and then we can go on out.